Our program is featuring two very distinguished speakers this morning, Colin Mayer and Kim Polese. This is a wonderful, intimate audience this morning. And as my friend Laura Roman reminded me, John Milton said, fit audience, let me find, though few. We are privileged to have Colin and Kim with us and looking forward to a wonderful, provocative conversation this morning. I would also like to extend a warm thank you to Citrix Systems for hosting us in their gorgeous conference center. A brief introduction to Churchill Club for those in the audience less familiar. We are Silicon Valley's premier business and technology forum, an independent group, nonprofit, and dedicated to encouraging innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. And this we do on a regular basis through the up to 40 programs that we organize each year, where like minds can connect with ideas and with each other. We are a member-supported organization, and we would welcome you to join us if that is of interest to you. We have an outstanding set of programs coming up over the next month or so, beginning on the 25th of this month with the CEOs of Jive and Box, and Peter Levine as well from Andreessen Horowitz, and that is called The Future of Work. We have Shell Oil Company President Marvin Odom on May 1. We have the incoming CEO of ARM, Simon Segars, on May 9. And the 15th annual Top 10 Tech Trends on May 23rd. And these are just some of the programs coming up, so be sure to keep an eye on us either through the website or get yourself signed up on our mailing list so that you can be notified directly. If you're tweeting this morning, you will find Twitter codes in your printed program. Please do use the hashtag Churchill Club. Our conversation leader, Kim Polese, is a prominent Silicon Valley entrepreneur and business leader. Currently, she is chairman of Clearstreet, which is a social finance startup focused on helping people build savings and achieve long-term financial health. Kim was famously the founding product manager for Java at Sun Microsystems and led its launch in 1995. She then famously co-founded Marimba and served as its president and CEO. Kim also served as CEO of SpikeSource, and she is a leading advocate of public policy to increase America's innovation capacity. In this regard, she serves on local and national boards, including President Obama's Innovation Advisory Board. And among her many awards and honors, Kim was named one of Time magazine's 25 most influential Americans. Let us give our warmest welcome to Kim, who will then introduce our guest of honor.
Thank you, Karen. It's delightful to be here this morning. Thank you all for joining us for what I know will be a very, very interesting, provocative discussion with Colin Mayer. And we're so delighted to have you here this morning with us, Colin, all the way from Oxford, England. So as we know, Colin is the former dean of the business school at Oxford University and currently the dean of management at Oxford. And he is the author of a new book called Firm Commitment, which will be the foundation for this morning's discussion. And Colin and I met several years ago at the Silicon Valley Comes Silicon Valley Comes to the UK conference, which is held every year. Actually, Silicon Valley Comes to Oxford, founded at Oxford. I guess about 12 years ago now, and has become a sensation and really one of the most, I think, important technology conferences, innovation conferences now in the UK. And it's actually a very valuable exchange in both directions. And actually, many people may not know that Oxford is one of the youngest top-tier business schools in the world. It's actually quite recently founded in 1996, and Colin was, in fact, the first professor at the Oxford Business School. And he has not only been a professor in academia, focusing on finance and operations, examining some of the world's leading companies, but also has been an entrepreneur himself, helped found one of the largest economic consultancy firms in the UK called Oxera. So he has really seen management from both sides, both studying it from outside and also living it from inside. Colin embraced really the opportunity to partner with Silicon Valley from the very beginning, and we are so happy to have you here with us in Silicon Valley at the Churchill Club this morning. So welcome again. Now, you have written a fascinating, very provocative book, and you really examine the very definition and purpose of the corporation and what you call the firm. One of the key points that you make in the book is that the corporation has really strayed from its founding purpose. Back in the 14th and 15th century, when the structure itself was created, its purpose was, in fact, in the service of society. And today, we're, in your view, very far away from that. And in fact, over time, as the LLC was developed, we started seeing the division between the governance and the control of the corporation and the introduction of outside investors. And that, in your view, really created a schism that now has resulted in some huge abuses of the corporate structure and some of the biggest financial disasters the world's seen over the last several years. So would love for you to expand a little on this, maybe give us a quick history lesson on the corporation, what went wrong, and then let's talk about your view about what we do about it.
Okay, so thank you very much for that, Kim. That's exactly right. The main theme of the book is to say that the corporation is a remarkable institution. It clothes, feeds, and houses us. It employs us. It invests our savings. It's the source of America's prosperity, of the growth of nations around the world. And at the same time, it's also a source of terrible deprivation and poverty and environmental degradation. And over the last few years, the problems have become much more acute, and we've had repeated failures, a variety of forms, not just environmental, the financial crisis, mis-sellings, frauds of a variety of different forms. And what underlies this is that the notion of what the corporation should be doing has been lost. The corporation is perceived, in particular in the context of countries like the UK and the US, as existing to further the interests of its owners, its shareholders. And the directors of a corporation owe its shareholders a particular responsibility to take account of their interest and maximize the value of the company. And that drives what the corporation is supposed to be doing. And that's a very misconceived notion, because a corporation does not exist primarily to further the interest of its shareholders. It exists to do things, to make things, to produce things, to create ideas and innovations, and to serve its customers, its communities, its employees, and nations. And in the process of doing that, it should generate profits. But those profits are a product of, not a purpose of the corporation. And what's happened is, it's become the purpose. And because it's become a purpose, it's undermined the corporation, what it's supposed to do, and actually it's been very detrimental for its performance as well. Why has this happened? Why has it become so acute now? It's become so acute because the nature of the corporation, its ownership, has changed. The corporation, as you were mentioning, was established really by royal charter to undertake things like voyages of discovery around the world, open up merchant trading. Then it was built railroads and canals, and then it became owned by families that held those companies for long periods of time. But those families faced a problem. How could they finance their growth? Well, initially they did it from banks, but then they turned to stock markets and they issued shares. And as they issued those shares, the ownership of the families became diluted and they lost control. And initially those shares were held by individuals and increasingly by pension funds, life insurance companies, pension funds, and other institutions, and mutual funds. And initially those institutions held those shares for long periods of time. 70 years ago, on average, they held them for 8 years. But it declined. 30 years ago, it was 4 years. Today, the average holding period is a matter of months, weeks, days, hours, seconds, in the case of high-frequency trading, nanoseconds. And that has had a frankly, a disastrous consequence because it's forced the corporation to become increasingly focused on short-term profits at the expense, basically, of everything else. And that's been the source of the problem.
So interesting. So technology has gotten us in this pickle to some degree because it's the high frequency, very high volume trading is really skewed, in your view, the interests of the shareholders or the outcomes of the corporation as a result.
Yes, certainly technology's facilitated that process, but I wouldn't say that technology was the fundamental factor that drove this. What really drove it was the attempt by institutions to diversify their portfolios. So initially, the families and individual shareholders would hold a relatively small number of companies, and they'd be actively involved in those. But it's actually as much to do with us, academics and economists, and financial economists in particular, preaching the notion of portfolio diversification, holding lots of shares. And that encouraged institutions to move in a direction of not focusing on long-term holdings of particular companies that they were actually actively engaged in, but holding large numbers of shares in small quantities and trading them rapidly. And it's that notion as to what a shareholder is there to do which is so damaging for the way in which the corporation has then evolved.
You give a very interesting example of Barclays and the LIBOR scandal in recent years, and basically that proves your point. Can you tell us a little more about that?
So some people say, well, the thing that avoids the problem becoming too acute is the reputation of companies, and companies want to maintain their reputations. But unfortunately, reputations don't solve the problem and actually can make it much worse. And the LIBOR scandal is a good illustration. It was Wednesday, June the 27th of last year at 1:30 p.m. up on the ticker tapes of the New York and London stock exchanges flashed the announcement that the UK and the US regulatory authorities had reached a settlement with Barclays Bank, by which Barclays Bank had been found guilty of the LIBOR scandal. And as a consequence, Barclays was fined £290 million. Between 1:30 p.m., when that announcement appeared on the ticker tapes, and 4:30 p.m., when the stock market closed, Barclays' share price rose. So the stock market was actually overjoyed to hear that Barclays Bank had been found guilty of the LIBOR scandal. Now, you might say, well, that was just a blip in its share price. But actually, over the subsequent 6 months, Barclays has had a torrid time. It's not only been found guilty of the LIBOR scandal, it's been found guilty of payments, protection mis-sellings, mortgage derivative mis-sellings. It's had to set aside £2 billion of provisions to pay compensation to its investors. And over that 6-month period, its share price has risen by 60% during a period in which the stock market as a whole has just gone up by 10%. And really what's going on is it's not just financial institutions where these perverse shareholder incentives can operate. When companies are found to have engaged in environmental abuses and failed to abide by environmental regulations, the reaction of the stock market of companies that do that is frequently positive, and certainly, in general, not negative. And really what's going on is that when a company is exploiting other parties, exploiting the market, as in the case of the LIBOR, or exploiting future generations, as in the case of environmental degradation, they are cutting costs, they are selling things that people don't want, to the benefit of corporations, reducing their costs, increasing their revenues, generating more profit. And when the stock market learns that a company has been doing more to promote shareholder interests, then the share price reacts positively. So from the point of view of the paymasters, the owners of corporations, the reputational impacts really can be quite perverse in pushing companies in directions that are quite antisocial.
And here over in the U.S., of course, we had the BP scandal, the Gulf of Mexico an environmental disaster. Have you noticed the same trend?
Yes, exactly the same. So in the case of BP, the only thing that turned it round and drove its share price down eventually was the fact that the US authorities reacted in such a strong way as to essentially foreclose some markets that previously were available to BP. Now, if the response is of that sort, that essentially it's not demonstrating an increase in profits by cutting costs, but it's essentially undermining its market, then you can get a negative reaction of share prices. But BP is a real classic example of what I'm talking about, because BP was upheld as being the example of a company in the world that had the best corporate governance. Okay? It had the right board structures, it had strong independent board members, separation of chairman and chief executive, placed a lot of emphasis on the traditional aspects of corporate governance, and yet it, at the end of the day, had failed to abide by the basic principles of safety and environmental standards. And why? It illustrates the point that I'm making really clearly. The more that you align a corporation with the interests of its shareholders through strong governance arrangements, the greater the conflict that you create with other stakeholders and other interested parties, in this case, with the environment and future generations. It may be with employees, it may be with other suppliers. The more that you shift in the traditional direction of strengthening the governance arrangements in companies, the worse can be the consequence in terms of the performance of the firm viewed from a broader basis.
So that's interesting. It sounds like, describing the problem, that regulation might be presumed as one of the solutions. You're saying no, regulatory action really doesn't help. In fact, hasn't done anything.
Regulatory responses have been the inevitable response to failure. So, for example, in the case of the financial crisis, the consequence of the financial crisis was to introduce a whole series of financial regulatory requirements, Dodd-Frank, and the Financial Services Act in the United Kingdom. And what those are doing are, for example, ring-fencing retail banking from investment banking, and the government recently said we're going to electrify that ring fence. We're going to regulate the bonus payments that can be paid to executives of banks. We're going to determine who runs banks, how much they are paid, what they can do, how much they can charge. And what's going to be the consequence? The consequence of that is that banks are going to do less of the things that are regulated, like lend money, which we'd actually like them to do, more of the things that are unregulated, like derivative selling, which we actually don't want them to do. They're going to do less in the form of formal banks, more in the form of unregulated shadow banking. In other words, it does not encourage ethical conduct. It promotes instrumental avoidance. And indeed, those who work in this area know that companies have so-called compliance departments, departments that are supposed to ensure compliance with regulatory standards. Those compliance departments are actually avoidance departments. They promote instrumental avoidance of regulation. So there are some areas where strengthening regulation is very important, and regulation can play a role. For example, in relation to public laws like bribery, corruption, market abuse, market manipulation, and environmental degradation. And there, the penalties of enforcement should be much more severe. But elsewhere, regulation is not the right approach to trying to deal with the problem.
So what is the right approach? And again, the problem that you're really focusing on is short-term versus long-term, and the shareholder basically becoming much more of a short-term agent and skewing the purpose of the corporation. What's the solution? If it's not regulatory action, if it's not a sense of responsibility on the part of the shareholders. What is it?
The answer is that corporations should take responsibility for their own conduct. What happens at the moment is they basically take the line of, we do whatever we can until someone tells us to stop us or fine us for doing something. And what that requires is that, first of all, corporations need to expound much more clearly exactly what is the purpose of the corporation and what are its values. In whose interest is the corporation being run? And is it just there to promote shareholder returns, or is it doing something that is of broader value than that? And in particular, demonstrating how it's credibly going to do that. We've had lots of corporate social responsibility, CSR statements,
right,
which unfortunately at the end of the day are generally meaningless, because when the crunch comes, companies are in financial difficulties, circumstances change, they just jettison those. That's not firm commitment. To demonstrate firm commitment, one needs to have in place the structures which show, in terms of ownership and control of the corporations, that if the corporation fails to abide by those principles, there's a consequence in terms of the performance of that corporation. Someone needs to take responsibility. And what is required is essentially to, first of all, bring in a longer-term perspective on the ownership of at least some established corporations, and secondly, to give boards more of the responsibility and more of the costs of failing to abide by the principles by which they say that they're going to be operating. And those elements are critical in terms of essentially turning around the corporation into an organization that we're going to be able to trust going forward. But let me then turn this round in a positive direction, because what I believe is really the remarkable feature of the corporation is its potential to deliver beyond what we've been talking about to date in terms of shareholder returns. The corporation is a remarkable instrument for providing commitment, for being able to uphold other values. It's essentially an Alice in Wonderland, this is how I describe it, which has become a Frankenstein. It's an Alice in Wonderland because it really can do things that we as individuals find it hard to do. But it's become a Frankenstein because of the way in which it's been captured by these particular interest groups. And I think Silicon Valley, in many respects, illustrates that potential very well. The reason why the corporation is such a powerful instrument for delivering social good is because of its very nature. The fact that it combines ideas, innovation, management with finance and brings the two together. That is what makes the corporation such a powerful tool. And it's essentially an element of separation between the two that allows the corporation to provide a commitment that goes beyond just thinking about financial returns. So that if that balance is right, what the corporation can do is create immense benefit to society at large.
And you're really putting your finger on one of the key issues here, which is the difference between wealth creation and wealth redistribution. So your point, if I understand, is that the focus has been too much on wealth redistribution. In other words, essentially trades for the sake of creating a cash return in the short term versus long-term creation of products and services that benefit society. So this sounds like a very, very good vision that you're outlining, but how do we get from here to there? And we've seen some voluntary, I think, efforts, and some that have been successful here, pioneered by companies in the Valley. Google is one, in the way that they went public, trying to create more of an even playing field, in the way that the founders are focused more on the long term and have created a different structure for the stock. Can you talk a little about, in practice, how would we actually affect what you're advocating?
Okay.
And how are companies around in Silicon Valley here doing that, the best examples?
So the key element really is at the stage at which a corporation shifts from being an entrepreneurial activity to being an established corporation. The entrepreneurial part, which is undertaken here in Silicon Valley, has been a very powerful instrument for generating new ideas. It's a real melting pot of networking and generation of ideas. And bringing that together with the element of financing has been the reason why Silicon Valley stands out anywhere in the world as being an incredible source of innovation and new ideas. The issue comes when you move from that stage, as you were describing in relation to Google, or LinkedIn, or Facebook, as to what happens then. What happens when a corporation has reached a certain stage of its development and it wants to go public, or the initial founders want to sell out? And typically what's happened has been that the founders have sold out their shares gradually over a period of time, and as I was describing in relation to the history of the corporation, by which those founders lose control and it becomes owned by widely dispersed shareholders. And that's really the point at which the change takes place, and that innovative, visionary notion tends to get lost. And what, as you were describing in relation to Google, where Sergey Brin and Larry Page retained a controlling interest in the company through having a voting structure which allowed them to do that, at the same time as they sold out shares on the stock market, has been critical in allowing that vision to go on being a feature of the corporation as it's been listed on the stock market. Now, you can't do that in Britain. And indeed, there are many people over here who believe that that is inappropriate, that it undermines the interest of shareholders, that there's a real risk that Reid Hoffman in LinkedIn is going to exploit the minority shareholders and they're not going to have enough control over the corporation. So there's a whole movement in the United States that's driving the US essentially in the same direction as the UK has already gone in terms of shareholder supremacy, that one should essentially not have those sorts of structures. And that, I think, is a very dangerous movement because it potentially undermines what gives rise to the long-term perspective, the notion that one might have objectives that are beyond those of pure shareholder return. And it essentially creates the type of outcome that we've observed in the UK, where the UK has, by any criteria, the best set of ownership and governance arrangements of corporations of anywhere in the world. Okay? It has free takeover markets, it has very good investor protection legal systems, it has pension funds and life insurance companies, wonderful corporate governance, disastrous economic performance and industrial performance. We now have 2 significant manufacturing firms left in Britain. 50 years ago, we had the world's best electronics industry and electrical engineering, chemical industry companies. They have all gone. And that's been attributed to a variety of causes: excessive trade unionism, immobile labor. Margaret Thatcher basically addressed those problems during her period. And what has emerged as being the underlying cause of that decline has been an excessive preoccupation and control by the stock market. So a critical element in terms of achieving what I'm talking about here is that the type of structures which allow corporations to select what is appropriate for their particular activities does not force them into a particular mold and presume that there is a right way of running business. is an absolutely key element in terms of creating the innovation and maintaining the vision that underlies the formation of the types of companies that we've been talking about here. And what I think is a real source of strength of the United States that differentiates it from Britain is its diversity, is the fact that you can incorporate in some states in the United States where you give management protection from shareholders, or you can incorporate in other states where shareholder control is very strong. Companies can choose, investors can choose. Not all shareholders have to buy shares in Facebook or LinkedIn or Google. They can choose whether or not they trust those founders to really promote the minority interest as well. And what I talk about is the notion of corporations as being islands. Islands with different values and different purposes, and the structures to deliver those different purposes, and people choose which island that they want to work for, invest in, buy from, etc. And it's that multiplicity that I think has been a source of immense strength for the United States. But as I say, it's under threat from a particular viewpoint about what the corporation should be.
So to maybe drill down a little bit further on the solution, you're advocating several things, as I understand it. One is a different kind of share structure, different kind of taxation treatment, a different way of organizing or voting boards in. Can you talk about, in more specifics, the prescription for how we fix this problem?
So the first problem that I talk about is the excessive preoccupation on short-term returns. And what I argue is that in some cases, what you want to have is a much closer matching of the period of the ownership with the activity that the corporation is engaged in. And where it's a long-term investment, you basically need to have shareholders that have a corresponding long-term horizon. And at the moment, there's no way in which you as a shareholder can signal that you're willing to hold your shares for years or decades as against the nanoseconds of the high-frequency traders. It's very different from bonds, for example, where you can. And furthermore, even if you could signal that, there'd be no incentive for you to do that, because if you can trade your shares, you've got liquidity benefits. And if you don't trade your shares, you've got no benefit from doing as such. So what I argue is, well, let's think about giving some companies the ability to confer the voting rights in those companies on shareholders who are committed, register that they are committed to hold those shares for long periods of time. And that will help to align the interests of the shareholders with the activities of the corporation. That's suited for some companies, it won't be suited for other companies, so companies should be able to choose whether or not that is an appropriate structure. That's one illustration. I also believe that we can do much more in terms of innovation, in terms of board structures. Some of the most successful companies in the world are Bertelsmann, which is the large media company, Carlsberg, a large brewery company, IKEA, the furniture company, Tata, the Indian conglomerate. All of those are owned by industrial foundations. And what those foundations do is they have, first of all, a charitable purpose. So the profits of the corporation essentially go to philanthropic activities. But even more significantly than that, what those boards do is to ensure that the corporations below them, like Bertelsmann and Robert Bosch, the automotive company, abide by the principles and the values of the corporation. And if the corporation fails to abide by its purpose, then it's that board that takes the responsibility for that failure. So that's another area where I think we need to have much more innovation in terms of the way in which corporations are run. And then I believe we can go further in aligning the interests of corporations with society more generally by using the tax system as a very effective way of doing that. Corporation tax is basically a nonsense within our current structure where we regard corporations as being run for the benefit of their shareholders. Why? Because you might as well just tax the shareholders directly. The only reason we had corporation tax was because it was thought to be a more effective way of raising tax for the government. When we now realize that corporation tax is a tremendous avoidance vehicle. But what, within the context of thinking of corporations as having a much stronger role in society, they can do is to align the interests of the corporation with society more generally. So let's take an example of natural capital, our environment. We can get companies to think in terms of not only investing in financial capital, material capital, but in natural capital. And one area where people are seriously talking about this is in relation to carbon emission. At the moment, what we do is we regulate. This is our standard approach. We have permits and we say companies are not allowed to emit more than a certain amount of carbon particles. But if you use the tax system, not only can you penalize companies that emit, but you can also subsidize companies that avoid, that have carbon capture technologies that they're employing, that develop new technologies to reduce the degree of carbon emissions. So you've got a much more powerful tool for aligning the interests of the corporation with society more generally. And that can be done not just in relation to natural capital, but human capital and social capital. And it's a very obvious way of thinking about how to bring society's interests into line with those of corporations. It's just extending the market. It's saying where we don't have private markets that do this effectively, let's think about creating the prices through the tax system.
So you're advocating really a combination, it sounds like, of voluntary action on the part of the corporation, along with potentially some new laws. And,
yes.
And we're also seeing the development of entities like the B Corp, the benefit corporation here in the U.S. That is, Patagonia is a member, is a B Corp. There are a number of small to medium businesses that are as well. It's also, I think, another effort to get at what you're talking about. Does the B Corp structure exemplify, in your view?
It exactly exemplifies what I'm saying. So the notion of having a benefit corporation illustrates precisely what I mean by diversity. It's an example of what one terms enabling legislation. Okay? It's legislation that allows companies to do more things, to structure themselves in different ways, as against prescriptive legislation, which tries to put companies into particular boxes. And the more that we have enabling legislation, the more of these islands that we can create that differentiate themselves and allow companies to determine what is appropriate for that particular types of activities. And there are lots of interesting experiments like that going on in the US. So the state of Washington at the moment has introduced something known as the Social Purpose Corporation, which is a bit like the B Corporation, but has some different elements associated with it. And that, again, to my mind, illustrates the fantastic strength of the United States in being able to have this legislative innovation. Okay, we think about innovation as being in corporations, and there has been an immense amount going on here, but we need innovation in terms of structures and laws as well, and competition. And that illustrates the great merit of the US. What is potentially a danger is too much pressure in the opposite direction.
And in fact, the B Corp is gaining some momentum legislatively. There's, I think, 10 states now, 10 or 12.
Yes, I think
that have passed legislation.
Yeah.
I think 20 additional states are considering legislation. And really, I think one question in my mind is, how do we get to that tipping point? So let's say that all 20 additional states pass that legislation. Are we really going to see companies voluntarily beginning to change their behavior? You know, is there a point where there's finally so much pressure to start to adhere to these new laws?
So your question is, what's to be done? How do we really promote this agenda? Well, I think there are a number of stages to it. The first one is in terms of this type of event and the ideas that I'm trying to put out in the public domain, which really are addressing the notion that is at the back of many people's minds, that there's nothing we can do about the problem, that we're locked into this system of the market prevails, the laws of economics mean that no one can really do anything to change what goes on, and we just have to put up with the fact that corporations are self-interested, that executives pay themselves outrageous salaries, and that we have to take the consequences of it. And what I'm trying to argue is there is no law of nature, there is no law of economy which says that this needs to be the case. It is not true that shareholder-oriented corporations are inherently more efficient or that they have to be structured in that way because that is the only way in which one can get economic efficiency. That is absolutely not the case. So the first thing that needs to happen is that message, that the underlying notions and theories of the corporation are wrong. And once one's done that, then the next element is really to begin, I think, at the stage of types of activity I'm engaged in terms of running business schools, teaching in business schools. And it really doesn't help if, as at present, in lesson 1 of a business school, you tell your students that the primary purpose of a corporation is to earn returns for its shareholders, and you, as future managers, have one purpose that you are going to go into those corporations to perform, and that is to maximize the value of the company. I mean, it's not surprising then that when people run corporations, that they believe that there's nothing else that they can do. Lesson 1 of a business school curriculum should be what is the purpose and what should be the values of the corporation. And lesson 2 then should be, well, given those purposes and values, what does that imply about the appropriate structures of ownership, governance, control, etc. of the corporation, and how should that be firmly embedded throughout the corporation. And so the reform of education so that people understand the purpose and values of corporations then leads into a notion of what the roles and responsibilities, as well as the rights and rewards of executives and owners of corporations should be. And so you then shift it to looking to role models in business to take a lead and to demonstrate that, first of all, it is feasible to run corporations with the types of characteristics that you were talking about. And secondly, that actually they are more commercially successful. Because a primary message that I'm trying to convey is that at the end of the day, a moral corporation is a commercially successful corporation. And there's an obvious reason why that's the case. And that is because if you trust a corporation in which you work or from which you consume, then you're willing to devote more effort in terms of what you do for that corporation. You might be willing to work for a lower wage. You, as a customer, will be willing to go back and repeat purchase from that corporation, and you'll be willing to pay more. So it is inevitably, at the end of the day, a more successful corporation as well. And indeed, the corporations that I was talking about, those industrial foundations, are in most cases the leaders in their particular sectors in the world. So the next stage is then really through the stage of role modeling to identify who really can promote these ideas. And there are some people who are playing a really important role in this regard. Ben & Jerry's is another
Yes.
example of a company that very much has followed this line and is now part of Unilever.
Mm-hmm.
And Unilever is a company that's run by Paul Pullman, who absolutely buys into this notion that this is what the corporation should be doing. But it also illustrates the problem that the structure of many corporations presents to those who've got these visionary ideas. Because Paul Pullman said, when I started at Unilever, I basically had to, within the first 3 months, institute the ideas that I had, get them embedded in the corporation, because I knew that within the first 3 months they couldn't get rid of me. And if one doesn't avoid the pressure that comes from shareholders in terms of driving just in the direction of increased profits, you cannot pursue a lot of these things. So that's why it's all very well having these worthy notions, but one then has to say, how is the corporation ensuring that its structure of its ownership and control is aligned with that?
I want to make sure that we get time for questions from the audience, so let me just pause and ask for any questions anybody in the audience might have.
I'm Mike Malone. Colin, doesn't this ultimately come down to a matter of measurement? One of the reasons the modern corporation has shifted more and more towards shareholder control is because we have a very sophisticated and nuanced measuring stick. We have internal accounting, we have audits, we have the stock market, we have balance sheets when reporting. I mean, we really know how to measure, flawed as it is, some sort of sense of whether a company is successful or not. And we can compare apples and oranges, companies in different industries, based upon this very sophisticated system, okay? That's distorted things towards shareholder control. The other parts of the corporation that you've been talking about, as yet, we really don't have any kind of measuring stick, right? I mean, in the 1990s, we saw a big boom to measure intangible assets, the rise of the intellectual capital movement. And that was supposed to produce this alternative balance sheet looking at intangibles. It's faded away. In social entrepreneurship, with the Skoll Foundation, which is, I mean, the World Summit of Social Entrepreneurship is going on right now at Oxford. Skoll Foundation rolled into that field 10 years ago with a lot of talk about social auditing and social balance sheets, where you could compare a AIDS orphanage with a criminal, a convict rehab program in San Francisco with an AIDS orphanage in Zambia. They've essentially bailed on that notion. So I'm curious, I'd like for you to address the question, can we actually institute any of these other factors before we have some way of accurately measuring and comparing?
Absolutely. And you've put your finger, Mike, on a critical issue, and it's one that is entirely misleading, because we have this notion that because shares are traded on markets and the prices of those shares are observable, that somehow it gives us a concrete way of evaluating the performance of corporations. In fact, what it is a large number of people making assessments on very little information about performance over long periods of time, for which there is no really established way of determining how to discount those profits in the future, let alone properly measure them. And that's why we get these huge fluctuations in share prices, which drive companies in one direction in 1 year and another direction in another year. And that was actually one of the fundamental problems associated with the shareholder control in Britain. I'll give you one example of this. GEC was the largest electrical engineering company in the world at one stage. And in 97, it shifted in the direction of out of electrical engineering and electronics into becoming a telecoms company because the stock market prices told companies to go and become telecoms company, and it collapsed within a matter of about 4 or 5 years. And in contrast, one can get very precise measures of many of the other activities that firms are engaged in. Now, I'll give you one thing that I'm currently engaged in at the moment: the measurement of natural capital. Okay? And countries around the world are in the process of adopting national accounts which will include the extent to which countries consume their natural capital, their woodlands, their rivers, etc. And business is beginning to adopt the same sorts of principles. Is it hard to do? The answer is, actually, it is far easier to do than trying to measure a nebulous, discounted present value of future profits into the indefinite future. Why? Because you can measure how much does it cost to sustain a woodland. How much does one actually have to invest to keep the water supply clean? How much does it cost to restock fish in a particular area? Those things are directly measurable today as costs, as against some sort of valuation into the indefinite future. And so the idea, and this is a concept that people keep on reiterating, that you have measurement that is, in some sense, precise for profits and shares, and imprecise in the other areas, that is entirely inverted in practice. And what is beginning to happen is that people are beginning to understand that actually there are much more effective ways of measuring these other things than A has been the case in the past, and B is true of profits and shareholder value.
Colin, thanks so much. This is a really fascinating discussion. David Rosenheim. And just leading on this point, I agree, because I'm actually in the business now of helping companies measure their carbon footprint. I run an NGO called the Climate Registry. I agree that some of these measurements can be very precise. The question I think that maybe Mike was getting at is, who cares? Is anybody really watching? To what extent, for example, is the integrated reporting movement taking shape? And I think this gets to some of the governance questions that you asked before. Absolutely. Right? If governance is set up really just to look at one metric and to be caring just about shareholder returns, can you comment a little bit about how that governance might change? I mean, how can we look to construct governance that takes into account natural capital, social interest areas, et cetera? How would companies, and is this something that's required of companies? I mean, there is a B Corp which provides for that flexibility, but how, I guess, both with measurement and with governance structure, do we get to boards that have more diverse interests represented?
And you've put your finger exactly on the key issue. The key issue is not, can we measure? But the key issue is, does anyone want us seriously to measure these other factors? And that is entirely a factor of the purpose of the corporation and whether or not the corporation is really set on pursuing those other objectives and ways of measuring those other objectives. Well, let's take the example of natural capital. And there are some very interesting cases currently in process of companies appreciating that actually from their own self-interest, it is critically important that they measure and understand the impact on their natural capital. One that's really gone a long way in this direction is Puma, where they have introduced systems of identifying the supply chain, and at each stage of the supply chain, determining what is the effect of that supply chain on their consumption of natural capital, and creating a measurement system to do that. Mars is trying to do something similar. And in those cases, what companies are appreciating is it's critically important that we do this, because as we consume our supply chain, we are undermining our ability to go on functioning in the future, because there comes a point at which it either becomes expensive or that supply chain is no longer in existence because that natural capital has been extinguished. So they're doing it from a very self-interested point of view. And that is one part of it. One wants companies simply to appreciate it's in their own interest to do a lot of this measurement. But is that enough? Is that going to capture all of our interest in natural capital? Obviously not. There are many elements, externalities in the typical economics jargon, which firms will not of their own accord internalize. And that's why I was talking about the alignment of the interest of the corporation with society more generally, using instruments like the tax system to do it, so that, as in the case of the carbon illustration that I was giving, it becomes in the self-interest of companies, because where there are these missing markets that fail to internalize the interest within companies, you provide them with an incentive to do it. And that combination of A, having the instruments to measure, appreciating that it is relatively straightforward to do the measurement, B, in some cases, it's in the self-interest and a realization on the part of companies. It's a realization that it's in their self-interest to do it. And C, where it's not, using incentives in particular through the taxes, is the way in which you can effectively drive in this direction that companies want to have these systems of measuring what they're doing effectively.
Yes.
This is Roger Chen, and from University of San Francisco. I have a question, actually. As I listen to your presentation, it seems to me you're kind of diverting your directions, because earlier in your presentation, you mainly talk about this kind of very large volume trading force companies to commit a lot of short-term behavior rather than long-term behavior. But later on, our discussion more focused on the social responsibility. So it reminds me, maybe there are two dimensions here. One dimension is where, the level of the social responsibility behavior, or irresponsible social behavior. That's one dimension. The other one is a more of long-term or short-term orientation in companies' behavior. So maybe, I'd like to have your thoughts to see if for these two different type of dimension behaviors, it's influenced by different mechanism, and therefore we need to think different solutions, because they are not necessarily the same thing.
That is a very astute observation, and that is exactly correct. That there are actually three problems. There's the conventional problem, which people believe to be the fundamental problem of the corporation, the agency problem, of aligning management's interest with those of shareholders, and if you don't do that effectively, then you get egregious performance on the part of management, paying them excessive salaries, etc. That's problem number one. The two problems that people do not talk about are exactly the two issues that you've just been talking about. One that you can regard as essentially a cross-sectional one, and that is to say that the interests of the shareholders are contrary to those of other parties, of employees, of communities, etc. The classic example of that is the financial crisis. The financial crisis was not an agency problem. It was exactly this conflict between shareholders who benefit from upside gains when things are going well, and the creditors who take the losses when things go really badly. Okay? And so the shareholders like the coin to be flipped, because they get the benefit when things go well, and the creditors take the losses, or the taxpayers effectively, when banks go bankrupt. And that sort of conflict afflicts not just creditors and banks, employees, suppliers, anyone who commits investment, human capital or whatever to the company, are exposed to that type of risk taking by the corporation. So there is that cross-sectional conflict that arises. And then there is the intergenerational one. The fact that what is in the interest of current generations of investors and participants is contrary to the interest of future generations. Okay? And that's basically what the environmental natural capital issue is about. And the problem is, when you solve one of those problems, like the agency problem, you make the others worse, because the more you align management's interest with that of shareholders, the greater the conflict with other parties like employees and creditors, and the more you align it with short-term shareholders, the greater the conflict with future generations. And that's why I'm so concerned about the pressure in the US at present to say, we've just got to solve the agency problem, we've got to strengthen the control of shareholders, because it's based on a very naive view of the corporation. The corporation is a more subtle and complex institution than that. And if you pursue that as the objective, what you do is you raise the types of conflicts that have emerged in the financial crisis, and you will worsen the conflict with future generations, and hence you worsen the environmental degradation problems. So you're exactly right. They require different approaches. And that's why I talk about thinking about addressing the intergenerational problem in terms of the longevity of shareholdings. Who is in control of a corporation? Is it the short-term shareholders, or is it in the hands of those with a long-term interest in the prosperity of the corporation? That addresses the intergenerational one. But shareholders, be they long-term or short-term, if they have too much power, will exacerbate the cross-sectional conflict. And therefore, that's why the separation between ownership and control can be so important and beneficial. Allow management to be able to run the company without being excessively preoccupied with shareholder interests if you want to reflect the interests of other parties in the corporation, such as the employees.
I wish we could go on for hours. This is such a fascinating topic, and I think actually you couldn't be having this conversation in probably a more receptive place on the planet here in Silicon Valley, where we pride ourselves on challenging conventional wisdom and engaging in disruptive innovation and long-term value creation. This has been such a fascinating conversation, Colin. Thank you so much for coming here today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, Kim, thank you very much indeed for having done this, and I'd just like to thank the Churchill Club for having organized this, Karen and Patty for having set it up, and Citrix for having hosted it here. It's been a real delight, and thank you very much to all of you for being here today and participating. Thank you.
Thank you.